Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Your host, Webster Tarpley, here in Washington, D.C. Let me remind you at this point, once again, you've got to get your copy of Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History, the long-awaited second edition, the first time the book has ever been printed as a paper book, a printed book. Now available from ProgressivePress.com and Amazon.com. Buy it where it's most convenient for you. This is the book that about 10 years ago correctly predicted not just that there would be a crash, but that it would be a breakdown crisis, a disintegration, and even told you the causes being the deindustrialization of the United States, the immiseration of the U.S. population with a loss of one-half now to two-thirds on the standard of living, and above all then the detonator is the derivatives bubble. Derivatives. If you're not talking about derivatives, you are hiding the cause of the current world economic depression. Credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles, asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, and so on down the line. Options futures, of course, exchange-traded derivatives, over-the-counter derivatives, designer derivatives, all equivalent to paper based on paper, side bets, bucket shop operations. All of this then growing to 1.5 quadrillion and finding this dramatic expression in the AIG hedge fund in London, which sold 3 trillion of derivatives. One little hedge fund more than the gross national product of France. And, of course, the big effort is to hide this stuff. So Obama has passed his peak. The main thing needed is a New Deal or moderate left, traditional anti-Wall Street challenge against Obama expressed in the Democratic primaries, but of course it can be expressed also outside. Now, let's remember the extreme vulnerability. Talking now about the color revolution in Iran, this is being done, of course, by institutions. It's being done by the BBC Persian service, which you don't hear because it's all done in the Farsi language. It's done by the RAND Corporation. It's done by the New America Foundation, obviously leading the charge. It's done by the various institutions of the Project Democracy in the federal government going back to Oliver North, the various Quangos. These are these quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, and so forth. Now, the news as of today is there have been these rent-a-mobs and dupe-a-mobs and swarming adolescents in the streets of Tehran all week. What we see there is very interesting. It's mob rule. Mob rule. The U.S. now stands for mob rule. Any elite, anybody who's interested in law and order, right? They say, we are the U.S. and we want law and order. We want the rule of law. Rule of law. You want mob rule. The technical term, ochlocracy. We can change the name from the Democratic Party to the ochlocratic party, the party of mob rule, because, of course, it was mob rule in the Democratic Party, right? Mrs. Clinton got more votes, but that didn't matter because the fervently idealistic, swarming adolescents of the Democratic Party demanded Obama. So Obama they got, and Mrs. Clinton got more votes. Those were taken away. She got more delegates, too. Those were taken away. And if a primary was not to the liking of Howard Dean, he quashed it in the name of mob rule. So forget the rule of law. This, of course, as a passing philosophical point, establishes a huge crisis of democracy. Huge crisis of democracy in the world, because if you can't count votes and have elections, then what is democracy at this point? Very, very serious problem now being created by these characters. It's really because the whole thing is a campaign against the modern nation state. The result, if the people power coup goes through, I'll tell you what the next step will be. It will be the microstates and mini-states of Zbigniew Brzezinski in his most recent books. In other words, the Bernard Lewis plan applied to Iran means that you have a central Iranistan, but then all of the other areas are lopped off, especially the Arabistan, Ahvaz area, the Abadan refinery, the Karg Island terminal. You've got pieces taken out as Baluchistan, pieces taken out as Pashtunistan. Other parts go to join Azerbaijan. Eventually, instead of one Iran, you'll have 5 or 6, just as instead of one Pakistan, you'll have 4 or 5. So that would be the next step, by the way. That would be Mousavi. If Mousavi comes in, rich elitist and sort of languid candidate that he is, that would be the next step. So today, big rally of the pro-Ahmadinejad forces, and interestingly, the class nature here is overwhelming. The bulwarks of Mousavi support are rich northern Tehran, the rich elitists of northern Tehran, and the desperate housewives of northern Tehran who identify with the wife of Mousavi. They come in and have their demo, but this is just the rich people in the capital. It's a little bit like France in the various French revolutions, right? France, 1789, Paris goes for the revolution, but the provinces do not. And there's always that story, and then undoubtedly that's what's happening today. You hear very little of any agitation outside of Tehran. It's simply limited to the capital. The guess that I have is that it's much narrower than the broad-based destabilization, which was essentially done through decades and decades of resentment and hatred against the Shah, fanned by the British-controlled mullahs and the British-controlled Persian service of the BBC, a branch of British intelligence. So today, I think a narrowly based color revolution, lacking a charismatic, telegenic demagogue to lead it, lacking any polling. The existing polling says that Ahmadinejad won the election because he has greater appeal among the lower classes, peasants, workers, blue-collar types, the urban plebs. Therefore, it's very likely that Ahmadinejad won the election and that this thing is in a complete hysteria of the same kinds of rich elitists that helped to put Obama into power. It's the rebellion of the liberal elitists, the people who think that they would do well under a U.S. puppet state. That seems to be what's going on there. Obviously, this does not mitigate the negative sides of the theocracy. On the other hand, the best way to let that get solved is to butt out. No interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. It is the path to war and catastrophe. Worth remembering that the destabilization of the Shah, the coming of Khomeini, then led to hostages. It led to Desert One. And around Desert One, there are stories that make your hair stand on end about an intervention by the Soviet Air Force and others that perhaps had much more of a superpower confrontation going than is generally understood, although this remains obscured by the fact that the archives clearly are not open, and Carter, Brzezinski, and so forth are not telling what went on. So Khamenei today, with a much awaited Friday prayers, Khamenei says, and of course this is the 19th of June. We're Juneteenth here in Washington D.C. It's the anniversary of the emancipation in the District of Columbia. This entire event now seems to be drifting towards toward the exhaustion of the people power coup forces, as Khamenei hangs tough. The critical turning point back under Carter was that the Iranian generals, were convinced that they shouldn't have a military coup to take over the situation. They should leave the door wide open to Khomeini. That's where you have the current regime, which has eventually, as time goes on, a national government becomes nationalist and therefore becomes less and less acceptable to the CIA. So that's why every 10, 20, 30 years, you've got to have a coup and get rid of the existing people, even if they were your agents to begin with, because they're beginning to act more and more like nationalists as the institutions begin to shape them more than you. I would also point to the interesting story of Robert Dreyfus, who is the correspondent of The Nation magazine, Katrina vanden Heuvel's man on the streets of Tehran. Robert Dreyfus wrote a book 30 years ago called Hostage to Khomeini, where he tells you correctly that Ibrahim Yazdi, the prime minister then, was a Pol Pot, trained in the same methods as the Pol Pot regime in in Cambodia, and that this guy Yazdi is now somebody that Dreyfus is interviewing, and Yazdi is telling him, oh, this is an outrage to democracy. We want democracy. We want Musavi. We want to be closer to the U.S. and above all to our dear Obama. We'll be back in a minute here on World Crisis Radio.